I do that, I wanted to also raise or break down what the heck is in a food safety plan. And as I'd mentioned, it's a written document that kind of gives you a roadmap of what your concerns are or potential hazards in your food, and it writes down what your plan is to control them. And so it looks like you're required to have these food safety plans if you're under the federal regulation. So specifically, that includes this thing called a hazard analysis. And if we find hazards, we then implement a control as the ones I just mentioned, the process allergen, process allergen supply chain plans. And then we think about a written plan known as a recall plan. And then all of the documents that would then show that we are actually monitoring those types of things. And so again, thinking back to, the slides I had presented earlier of thinking of, okay, well, every food has different risks and we manage them in different ways. The food safety plan helps us to specifically identify those pieces. And as I'd mentioned before, when we're designing or thinking about embarking on food safety, embarking on new value-added products, it's important to be thinking about what those food safety considerations are. So another important component of a food safety plan is some details that help us articulate what the food product is. So what we call this is, a product description of what our product is, and a communication tool known as a process flow diagram and a process description. And these are just written tools to help you and your team start thinking about how to identify those hazards. So I always like to start with this in particular with new entrepreneurs if they're trying to get some food safety consultation help. Oh, I'm about to make this new chocolate chip cookie. Could you help me make sure that my product's safe? One great tool that if you're trying as a new entrepreneur to try to communicate with food safety consultants or regulators is to start thinking about what your product description really is. So as you can see here on this example I have on the slide, this is a chocolate chip cookie, and it's an all natural, preservative-free, shelf-stable, fresh baked chocolate chip cookie. And then it has the ingredient statement, and it also declares my allergens. And it shows who I'm serving it to, how it's prepared, how long it lasts in the market, and how you prepare to eat it. And in this case, we just eat it, ready to eat, okay? But to me, as a food scientist, as a food safety nerd, this gives me a whole host of information about potential concerns or controls that are already in play because of what they've told me, right? Since it's shelf stable, I'm already thinking that they had some sort of cooking step to reduce the water that makes it more stronger shelf life and reduces micro risks. The fact that it has some allergens listed, it's telling me too that we have to be careful about if this is produced in a facility that doesn't have allergens, and it has to be labeled somewhere. So it's giving me some key pieces of information that can guide me in the future about how I operate in my facility and how I communicate to consumers. So another tool that's really helpful in the world of product design and food safety is this tool that we call as a process flow diagram. And basically, this is images or square segments that break down each part of the process so that we can look at them individually. And so the one I have presented here is an operation of that chocolate chip cookie company. So we have different ingredients receiving, right? We get our refrigerated butter and eggs. Then we have a whole cohort of dry goods. And then we have things that could go out into our warehouse, like our labels and packages. And then along the way, we mix this product, and then it gets formed and then frozen for shaping, and then later gets baked, cooled, and packed. but process flow diagram is a very helpful tool because it gives us a visual representation of the overall process so that we can kind of see again how this product is being operated. And again, this is a very helpful tool that if and or when you start needing to get help in your design, you're sharing how these things are being processed, because it informs others about what this product is or isn't in the process. And later, from a food safety side, it helps us start to think targeting about where we could have potential hazards and how we can control them later. So when we start thinking about the process flow diagram, it gives us, as I mentioned before, this example. We've got the process of fracking. It gives us some details, and as well as it gives us the product descriptions here with the baking steps. This gives us some insight about how we're looking at the hazards. So when we do that, we're then able to start getting understanding what our potential concerns are in the operation. Okay, so when I say a hazard analysis, this is a processing step. You know, it's not a processing in the operation, but it's a strategic process that we look at our whole ingredient line and the production line, how we're operating, and see if there are any potential concerns. And if there's a flagged hazard, we then flag it and then start thinking about what type of controls we would put in to protect the food. Okay, so basically what we do is we look at each processing step, we identify the hazards, then we justify if it is the hazard or how or why, and then we think about some sort of preventive control that we could have, and then we start thinking about how we would implement this. Okay. So I just wanted to raise a hazard analysis is a very important component when you design a food, and it can be a very simple approach of controlling these hazards. And I'll give some examples in a moment, but it's the basis of your food safety plan. But most importantly, it's the way to introduce you identifying what your hazards are and finding a way to control them to produce safe food. And as I had mentioned earlier, every food product has its own set of hazards and concerns, but it's up to you as the entrepreneur to understand what those food product hazards are. Okay, so this slide here is just kind of giving a whole highlight of different types of hazards that might occur. So for example, if we were doing cookies again, we know that if we make cookie dough itself, we can have a concern of bacteria, something like salmonella, often found in eggs. And if we don't cook that could cause harm. So knowing that we have to cook it raises a higher alarm bells in our operation of thinking, how are we going to control that? And so it's telling us, it's giving us a clue that later, wait, we need a plan. How are we going to make sure that we cook at the right time, at the right temperature every time, all the time? Okay. So as you can see here, there's a whole host of different types of hazard controls that we can use. And they're really driven, dependent on the type of product and the type of process that we're operating on. So this here is just a quick example of what a hazard analysis tool is that we use when we're conducting a hazard analysis. And we break down those hazards into biological, chemical, and physical hazards. So in the case of our chocolate chip cookie that I was just bringing it about first, just to kind of give you a quick little glimpse about how we look at those things. If and or when we were receiving our ingredients, we would start thinking about what are the hazards, right? So I had mentioned before that eggs, for example, is known to have a biological concern of something like salmonella. And so we know we're deliberately bringing in eggs. So this is kind of giving us a flag, whoop, 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 hazard, be aware. that I know I have to keep an eye on those eggs and we're going to cook it later, but I have to be thinking about cooking that at a subsequent step. And the same thing with incoming raw materials, things that are known to be allergens, they are required to be labeled by law. So in my hazard analysis, I know, okay, I'm receiving certain ingredients that I know could cause a concern. I need to have a plan later to declare those allergens on our label. Okay, so there's hopefully this is kind of giving you a taste about how to be thinking about those hazards. As I had mentioned, each food product has their own hazards and have to be identified. And this is super helpful to be aware of from the beginning. So you're thinking about those food safety controls now as you're developing new food products, okay? So another thing I wanted to raise your awareness to is just thinking about if you are going to produce a value-added food product and you do fall under the preventive controls rule, under the federal regulation, be aware that there are some specific exemptions of the preventive controls rule for small processors. So it's based on your distribution, your size of business and revenue, et cetera. And I have guidance here on this website here. But if you are thinking about doing value-added production, or you are presently making value-added products, I want to raise your awareness and encourage you to file for the attestation, because while I'm still going to advocate that you should have a food safety plan to control those hazards I just talked to you about, if the federal regulation, if the feds came to your facility for an inspection, under the qualified exemptions, you wouldn't fall under the whole rule. So it gives you a little bit of leniency. You still have to identify your hazards and you still have to monitor them, but it doesn't have the same level of scrutiny. And so just thinking and being sensitive to being a smaller business and knowing all of those facets can be pretty daunting. It gives you a little bit of breathing room as you start to pull these things in together.